Welcome to Not Going Quietly, the podcast where we inspire growth, beat down biases, and get into all sorts of good trouble with your host, Britt East. No topic is off limits as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy. So get ready to join us for some courageous conversation because Not Going Quietly starts right now. Hey everyone, welcome to Not Going Quietly, the podcast for outraged optimists and heartbroken healers all over the world, where we surface life's searing truths in the name of radical togetherness. I'm your host, Britt East, and I have such a fantastic featured guest today. I can't wait to get into it, so let's dive right in. Since 2002, Steve Yacovelli has focused his energies on building the doghouse, working with awesome clients like the Walt Disney Company, IBM, Bayer, Covestro, Merck, George Washington University, the Public Library Association, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, PBS, the Ohio State University, Accenture, and Bell South AT&T, among many others. Steve holds a BS in Public Relations from Millersville University of Pennsylvania, an MA in Educational Policy and Leadership Development from The Ohio State University, and an EDD in Instructional Technology and Distance Education from Nova Southeastern University. An award-winning Amazon best-selling and, in some circles, banned author, Steve has written books and articles focusing on consciously inclusive leadership, creating a sense of belonging for all team members for business success and helping people be more resilient in times of change in the workplace and beyond. With over 30 years' experience in workplace leadership, learning strategy, and change management, Steve is a rare breed of professional that understands the power of using academic theory and applying it to the workplace setting to achieve business results. Oh my gosh, I cannot wait to dive into this today. Steve, how the hell are you?
Good, Britt. How are you? So many dog puns. I can't stand it.
I know. It's all I can do to keep a straight face while I was reading it. It's so excellent. It's so excellent. So tell us what the doghouse is.
So Top Dog Learning Group is actually the business a colleague of mine and I started in 2002 as a side hustle while we were at Disney. She approached me one day. We were actually worked for Disney Cruise Line, and she pulled me aside. I mean, funny thing, when you work for a cruise line, you're kind of sequestered with your coworkers for like a week or depending how long the voyage is. So we had dinner, and she's like, "We should start a business." I'm like, "We have jobs." She's like, "No, it's like a side business. We're the perfect chief learning officer together." I'm like, "All right." So we went to our senior vice president of HR, and we told her the deal. And she's like, "First of all, thank you for sharing. Don't use Disney time. Don't use Disney stuff. Good luck." And then that's kind of how Top Dog was born. And, it was like a side hustle we did for several years. We basically would meet once a week, talk about how we, tackled the training world. And I'll tell you exactly what the doghouse does in a minute. And then in late 2007, I found myself out of a job. I was fired from my last corporate gig. To this day, I live in Florida. Florida's right to work state. I still do not know why. However, in early 2008, I decided, well, I have this part-time business thing, infrastructure. Let's make it full-time and see what happens. And she kept working her way up the Disney ladder and actually retired a really, really senior manager. And then I started doing this doghouse thing. And basically, I like to say Top Dog Learning Group, we focus on four main areas, or our doghouse sits in four main areas, if you will. We focus on essential leadership. So it's kind of like the things you need to do as a leader. And then we define leader as anybody in the workplace who has influence. So that's really everyone, or as I like to say, all y'all, since I'm now a Southerner. We focus on inclusive leadership. So how can any leader create that sense of belonging and safety for any of the folks that they're working with? I do focus on LGBTQ plus leadership, obviously being the gay leadership dude. We can talk about that. And then focusing on what we call resilient leadership. So how do you as a leader lead people and also lead yourself through times of change? And we do those different areas in a bunch of different solutions, off the shelf training, online or in person, group coaching sessions. We do consulting services. I do a lot of keynotes and lunch and learns, both virtual and in person. And so it's been a really cool gig, kind of having having this doghouse sit there for the last 16 years, several bumps in the road. I'm sure if you're listening or watching, you too have faced some bumps in the road over the 16 years. But knock on wood, it's been a pretty good ride, and the dog is quite healthy. Knock on wood.
That is so cool. Well, let's define some of these terms for our audience. Like, what does leadership means? It's one of those words we use all the time, and it gets almost like so overused it can become pat. So help us understand, like, what are you specifically talking about? What is leadership?
When the first idea I had about understanding the concept of leadership was actually from my mom. And my mom, and I'm very fortunate to still have both my parents, but my mom was a professional secretary. She worked at an elementary school pretty much her whole career. And it was a small elementary school, and she was the only secretary, and she reported to the principal, but she ran that school. I mean, she was the goddess. Everybody knew Joyce. Everybody had to go through Joyce, to the point where if a prospective teacher would come in to have a job interview with the principal, they would, of course, report to my mom. She would send them into the principal's office. They would leave after the interview, and the principal would immediately come out and say, Joyce, how did they treat you? And it really kind of got me thinking about what leadership is versus position. My mom ran that school, but she wasn't in quote unquote charge. And I think that's the concept of leadership. Leadership is about influence within the workplace. So everything we talk about is leadership, and people are like, well, I don't have direct reports. I'm like, shenanigans. You do. You influence everyone else around you. And I think that's the way you should be thinking about leadership. It's not just for the person who has, five team members, or, they're running this project over here. Everyone in the workplace is a leader. And I think that's getting through that chain first is the first step for people to accept that leadership is not about position, it's about influence.
And so why is it important for queer people to be leaders, or to embrace our role as leaders, or to be better leaders?
Yeah, there's so many reasons why. The first is that any person who wants to be successful needs to figure out how to embrace some of these leadership competencies. And one of the things that I was pretty excited about when I wrote my, not the last book, but the book before that, was really starting to understand and think about, what does an effective leader do? Where do they focus their energies? And you're doing this for 30 years and work with a whole ton of leaders, you start to see what works and you start to see what doesn't. And so that's kind of where I started thinking about the top 6 leadership competencies that I think really make or break a leader. Anyone, doesn't matter if you're queer or not. So it's, if you're not watching, it's authenticity, leadership courage, having empathy, effective communication, building relationships, and shaping culture. And so those are the ones that the leaders who are rocking and rolling are doing these 6. Those who are kind of crashing and burning aren't doing these 6. So now put that through the rainbow lens, as I like to say. And if you're watching, you can see the beautiful little rainbow happens to be 6. Perfect. Let's talk about authenticity. Well, any leader who wants to be effective really needs to be authentic. The Brene Browns of the world, and a lot of other leadership gurus say, if you want to be effective, you need to be authentic. And, side note, instead of the gay leadership dude, I actually want to call myself the gay Brene Brown, but her people didn't like that so much. So I kind of couldn't do that. So, but anyway, but yeah, so authenticity, I'm a leader. People see that, and people will trust you if you're being authentic. Now put that through the rainbow lens. If I'm an out gay man at work, if I'm that transgender person being my authentic self, that's powerful. And in my last book, Pride Leadership, I actually talk about how you channel that authenticity and that power that you're already exercising into effective leadership. And so I think both, not just for our own personal gain, our professional success, do queer folks and non-queer folks need to be thinking about leadership, but also with the things that are happening against our community and against many other underrepresented minorities. It takes effective leadership to steer the course through that and beyond, and make effective change and make inclusivity.
So are these qualities something that all of us have intrinsically? Do we have to learn them? Do we have to practice and hone them? What are these?
It's a great question. I equate leadership like, say, athleticism. Some people can just get on the field, get on that court, get on wherever, and they just pick it up and go. Others really have to work at it, just like any other new practice that you're doing. So I argue that, yes, some people might be gifted in some of these things, like, oh, I'm a very empathetic person. Fantastic, that you're just one step ahead. But if I'm not, you can work at it. That's fine. There's lots of skill building activities, areas of focus, reading books, taking classes, practicing, that you can build up these skills. You just may be starting in a different spot, just depending on who you are.
And how, if I'm a leader and I have other leaders in my organization, and we're all have different kind of like skills and capabilities, How do we influence each other?
And it's funny. I had somebody ask me not too long ago, what's one of the secrets to effective leadership? If I had to pick one thing, and it's actually effective feedback. So it follows under the communication kind of area. But the concept of feedback and listening, I think, is one of the most underutilized leadership tools out there. And it's not just listening like, oh, I hear you, Britt, that's great. No, it's really listening to what you're saying. And Stephen Covey, if you're familiar, big leadership guru back in like the 90s and 00s. To paraphrase him, he said something to the effect of, we often listen to respond versus listen to understand. And I think smart leaders who are working with other leaders within their workplace, and again, all y'all are leaders because everyone has influence, are really doing that communication back and forth, are listening to what people are saying and sometimes not saying, and then providing that feedback in a non-biased, non-judgmental way so that we can help grow together. And I think that's one of the things I see in smart organizations that are feedback rich. So they're using feedback as a way to say, you know what, I just want to be better. I'm not going to be perfect as a leader. I'm going to hiccup and I'm going to empower you, my friend, to call me out on it, but in a respectful way. Are you okay with that? Sure, Steve. So then when I say something in a meeting, like, hey, Steve, maybe you want to rephrase it this way. Thank you for that. I didn't hear that. Well done. Move on. And that's really what helps everybody grow. The whole a high tide raises all ships thing. If we're all embracing that concept of feedback in order to give that gift and grow, then we're really going to succeed no matter where our leadership style is starting.
It sounds like you're almost describing relationships, relatedness, building trust. And, with a lot of the adverse experiences that many of us have had, whether it's through structural homophobia, straight supremacy, whether it's through issues with our family, whether it's through feeling marginalized, being disinvested. Those relational skills can be tough for people in our community. So how can we learn those?
If I look at the 6 competencies that are behind me, it's really a combination of many of them. And I think that's what I also love about these 6. And I really, I pulled in my one of my BFFs who does a lot of the same leadership, organizational development stuff that I do. And he's one of my besties. So I bribed him on a Friday afternoon with a bottle of rosé, sitting in my office. And I said, I did a bunch of research before he got there. And I said, what do you see as the competencies that really make a difference in the workplace? And we had Post-it notes all over my office of all the different things. And we started grouping them together. And that's kind of how these 6 started. And again, if you're not watching, it's authenticity, courage, empathy, communication, relationships, and culture. But the cool thing about all these is they are not little silos. And yes, in my books, I treat one as a chapter, but they are so gorgeously intertwined. And so, you can't build relationships, for example, if you're not being empathetic. You can't build or shape a workplace culture if you're not having some courage to maybe make some things different. I can't be my authentic self and expect to, go back to relationships, connect with other people. And so I think as we look at ways that queer folks and non really engage in these things, that whole relationship thing, I often say in many of my classes in the books that if you're doing authenticity, courage, empathy, and communication, you're already building relationships, because usually we're talking about you're engaging with other humans. And it is just like any other relationship you have. Smart leaders are building trust. How do you do that? You connect with folks in an honest and mindful sort of way. And so if you're doing that already, with your friends, you can do that with those coworkers that maybe you're not super excited about, but as long as you approach it in that empathetic, respectful way, you're going to have good ground.
It almost sounds like connection, fostering these relationships is a choice. It's not just something that magically lands in our lap. It's something that we decide to do. Like, hey, here's my lived experiences. Here's who I am as a person. And this other person has all their lived experiences, who they are, their cultural stuff, their aptitudes, their affinities, all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to choose to embrace them, all that they are, all that I experience, all that I know that they are in this professional setting, through this professional lens. I'm going to choose to embrace them and find points of connectedness, even if, there might be parts of all of our lives that we share. But it's like a pragmatic choice. Am I on the right track here?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But, I think too, as speaking as a member of an underrepresented minority who, especially on the front lines these days in the culture wars, I teach a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion, inclusive leadership, all that stuff. So I live in this world where we try to understand others, but you also have your own value system. And I've been using that conversation with a lot of folks. Just because you work with someone doesn't mean they have to be your BFF. Fine, but you do need to adhere wherever you work to your workplace values. And honestly, I've yet to work with a client partner who somewhere in their corporate values isn't something about embracing differences. Great. So, I can sit next to or work with a client or whatever who maybe has very different personal values, but if we both work using the workplace values, then we're okay. Now, the challenge becomes when that individual who has their personal values, well, I don't like others, and the workplace says, no, 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 we embrace inclusiveness and differences. That's an internal conflict that person has. And that's where I say, you need to have a conversation with yourself, because if you're going to work here at XYZ place, you're expected to be like this. That's the baseline, the way we do business. And it really makes people start to think like, okay, so I don't necessarily want to embrace this DE&I stuff, but if my workplace says I have to, that's the expectation, then maybe this isn't the place you should work. And having those hard conversations with people has been really interesting. And so I often start the conversation with someone who has very different personal values than me, something to the effect of, that's a very interesting perspective. What got you there? And then that whole listening to understand thing. And usually you start to unpack that and then have that dialogue versus, oh, you're one of those blank people who votes this way. I can't be with you anymore. And yes, I'll admit that's hard for me sometimes to approach. So I've really been shifting my focus to say, it's not necessarily about a party or affiliation. It's the values that lead you to support that specific area. And what is it about those values that got you to support that person or that topic or whatever's the difference that we have.
Yeah, it's like you're describing cognitive dissonance, like where we might, and I've experienced this personally, and because I have a corporate career aside from getting to host this podcast, and I've certainly worked with coworkers who I am absolutely convinced that they had genuine affection for me, both personal and professional, and feelings of friendship, and would also vote to send me to a concentration camp tomorrow. And so, like, how we as queer people wrestle with that internal experience of acknowledging what's real, like earlier, like you described, I would cast those people out. I would cast them off. I'd like, oh, screw you, I don't want to know you or whatever. But as I matured and grew, I saw and especially meeting the love in their eyes, the genuine affection for me, it really threw me, because I just assumed that they, would only wish harm for me. But to see them with the general affection, to experience all these positive workplace situations and emotions, and to also hold the other truths as well simultaneously, that they might vote in ways that would actually harm my body and my marriage and my life, which are ultimately unloving acts. I can't help but wonder if some of these questions are meant to be lived and not answered, meaning there's dignity and grace and wrestling with these questions, as opposed to definitively, with certainty, casting people out of our lives, out of almost some sort of a purity test.
I often say that I am so happy that I'm gay, because otherwise I wouldn't have that otherness experience. Because, if you're not seeing me, I'm a white cisgendered gay dude. But if that gay part wasn't there, how would I have interacted with the world? What lived experience would I've had differently? I acknowledge right now, I automatically have privilege as a white dude. Then you throw the gay thing. Oh, now I got, thrown back a little bit. But had that not happened, my experience might have been very different. I may not have really gravitated toward teaching inclusivity as a way to make a living. And so I think you're right, Britt. I think sometimes it's understanding that otherness, and actually in a lot of our inclusive leadership programs, I help people see that, because when I am in front of 30 white cisgendered straight dudes and they're like, arms folded, look like they just ate a lemon because they were voluntold to be in my class, on being an inclusive leader, I help them first see that they're diverse too. And I use this really cool model. I've been using it since I started doing diversity stuff when I was at Disney. And it's called the 5 layers of diversity. And if I can real quick, I'll kind of walk folks through this because it's a really cool tool to help really break down some of those barriers. And this is by two women, Lee Garden Schwartz and Anita Rowe, really awesome trailblazing women in the DE&I space. And they said, you know what, every human is made up of these 5 layers. And so the first layer is what they call personality. And personality is, no one will be like Britt. No one will be like Steve. Even if I'm a twin, if you know any twins, they're very different. Their personalities are different. And so at its core, what makes you and diverse is your personality. I'm an introvert. I'm an extrovert. I'm this, that. Yeah. So that makes you. Now, the next layer out, Garden, Schwartz, and Rowe talk about is their internal dimensions. And these are things that are pretty locked in, but, there's a little malleability here. There are things like gender identity, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, your physical ability. Most of those are pretty locked in. Obviously, some like physical ability might change. Obviously, my age is going to change each year, but I can't change that. And that's usually where people, when they say, oh, diversity, it's about this stuff. Yeah, and as our improv friends say. And so then they say there's the next one is the external dimensions. Now, these are things that may change sometimes even daily, but they do impact how you look and interact with the world. Things like my geographic location, my income, personal habits, religion, my physical appearance, my recreational habits, my education, my work experience, if I'm a parent or if I'm married, those all impact things. I'm not a human parent in this lifetime, as Britt, you and I were talking before we started recording. I am a canine parent. So that might make things a little bit different on how I look at the world than someone who does have human kids. Fine. It just is what it is. My single friends look at the world a little differently than me as a married person. So those are fine, but those are things that still impact my way of interacting with the world. Then they go into organizational dimensions. And these are in the context, of course, of the group that you're with. And so it could be the workplace or wherever. So it's like where you physically sit, which division, what's your work content. I'm in accounting, I'm in sales, I'm on the front line in the factory on the floor, whatever it looks like. Could be my seniority, could be where my work location is. Oh, I'm in the New York office. Oh, I'm in the Arkadelphia, Arkansas office, whatever that looks like. So now it starts to tie to geography a little bit. It could be I added this concept called legacy organization because I work with a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And you often hear people say, oh, you're from the old blank, blank, blank place that we bought, and so they treat you different because, yeah, it was a different lived experience. And so these are also ways that we interact with the world. And then the last layer that they added just not too long ago was called country of operation. So the concept is wherever you're physically sitting in the world does interact with how you look at the world. So it could be the political system, the economy, the laws, the language, the values, the business etiquette, the social structure. I often use the example, for whatever reason, I have 4 of our big clients who are all German-based, multinational, but they're all German-based. I don't speak German. I mean, it just happened to be that way. And I've noticed that country of operation permeates throughout for the concept, say, of timeliness. If you are familiar with the German culture and not going into any stereotypes, but in Germany, timeliness is a sign of respect. So if that meeting starts at noon, I know my German friends or the folks who work for German-based companies, about 5 minutes before is what happens. Now, I also have, sitting in Central Florida, I have a lot of friends who are from the Latinx community. And they often tell me, like, oh yeah, is that like real time, Steve, or Latin time? And again, it's not a stereotype, but the concept of timeliness is just slightly different. Not better or worse, it's just different. And so if that meeting's at noon, some of my Latinx friends may or may not, depending on who they are, get back to personality, they might be there 5 minutes and they're like, well, that's when the meeting really starts. The first 5 minutes is people to get there, settle down, get their coffee, have chit chat, and then you have the meeting. Neither one is right or wrong, but it is the country of operation that permeates. And so I think when you sit down with somebody, to make my long-winded story not so long, when you sit down with somebody and they immediately go to those internal dimensions, yes, but you find those ways to connect maybe in those external dimensions or the organizational dimensions, country of operation, and really connect with that person and kind of move the conversation from there.
That is so helpful. It's like, I think I want to put that on my fridge. So hopefully everybody can watch this on YouTube when we post it, because he's sharing some amazing visuals. That was really, really clarifying. And what I like again is it reinforces the concept of choice, which is a function of self-empowerment. So it's, as an employee, I might, in any industry, in any workplace setting, I might be thinking to myself, okay, how am I going to move this opportunity forward, this challenge, resolve this challenge, drive the business forward, whatever efficiency, revenue, whatever dimension you're seeking to add value to. It's a choice, and the understanding, like, hey, it involves people, so it's gonna be messy, and it's not going to just follow a perfect plan from A to Z. And I'm going to make the choice to find points of connection, understanding this kind of self-empowering framework to find points of connection. And it doesn't mean that I'm selling out my community. It doesn't mean that I'm a sellout. It doesn't mean that I'm a capitalist pig. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad person. In fact, just the opposite. I feel like it helps us honor the intrinsic complexities of all of our lives and cultural norms and identities.
And I think, as we look at how divisive the world can be at times, I've done this exercise before where I have a little, handout, and there's little spaces for all those dimensions of diversity, and people are supposed to fill them in, like, oh, I'm this, I'm married, I have kids, I identify as white, I'm gay, blah, blah. And then they sit down with somebody who they don't know, and they just count the ones that are in common, not the ones that are different. And it starts to really help people see that, because so many folks go right to the internal dimensions and that's it. Matter of fact, even when I'm starting to work with a client partner, and they're like, oh, we want to be more inclusive, we'll bring Steve and Top Dog in. And it's a great team, and it might be me and one of my top doggers, I call my consultants. And we'll start to ask those questions like, well, would you consider your workplace inclusive? Absolutely, Steve. We have blank month. Great. But let's go further than that, And so, using this model really helps people open their eyes to what the concept of true diversity looks like.
Well, let's explore that some. Like you previously referenced a phrase, consciously inclusive leadership. What does that mean?
So, quick story. When I first started playing around with this stuff, as I said a few moments ago, it was when I was at Disney, and I was doing a training class on unconscious bias. And I remember it was some of my first ones, and there was a person in the back who, again, that clearly was voluntold to be in this Steve session on unconscious bias. Arms folded, ate a lemon, just really sour, surly. So break happens, and I go up to Pat, we'll just use that name, and said, Pat, is there something on your mind? Yeah, Steve, you talked about unconscious bias. I'm like, yes, that was the first topic we talked about. If it's unconscious, I can't do anything about it. And Pat gave me a massive gift that day, because it really got me thinking about, well, people, if they say unconscious bias, they just automatically assume, well, I can't do anything about it. It's unconscious. So from that day forward, I started using the antonym, or the opposite, consciously inclusive. So we can think about it to be inclusive. For some things that might be natural, others we might have to work at it, and that's okay. But the concept of having unconscious bias and saying I can't do anything about it is shenanigans. You can. It takes work, just like anything else you want to get better at, any other skill. And for some people, it might be very easy because they don't have those hard, fast biases that they grow up with over time and all that good stuff. Others, it might be very deep ingrained, and it may take a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of interactions with people from that whatever group you're not feeling comfortable with or have a bias against. But I think it really, using that phrase, pushes the concept that we can do something about it. It just takes effort and really that focus on the conscious.
I absolutely love that. I really love the jujitsu you did on that phrase, and I love the phrase consciously inclusive leadership. I'm definitely going to plagiarize that. And again, I love it because of the empowering choice part. I love it because it recognizes, hey, it requires a commitment from me, and I have to start where I am. And even if I'm not the most perfectly conversant in the dynamic array of terminology and jargon that a community might be using in any particular moment, I'm going to try, and I'm going to get it wrong. But because I'm establishing this good faith effort every day along the way to do a little bit better, I'm going to build trust, and people are going to give me space and grace and educate me and help me to be the best version of myself, to create the best work environment that I can.
100%. And when you think about what you all just said, Britt, it's really thinking about those 6 competencies that I had up here. Oop, here they are. You're doing all these 6. You literally are. You just I'm like ticking them off in my head. You're having empathy. You're building relationships. You're helping to shape a workplace culture. Yes, and that's why it works. And I think if we go into a situation in the workplace or beyond where we give that ownership, hey, look, I love how what you said, be my better self, be my best self. If you're approaching leadership from that heart-centered, I just want to be better, call me out on it respectfully. Yes, that is why feedback is such a game changer when you're trying to create a more inclusive workplace and a more inclusive self. It's because you're giving permission for folks to see honestly what your unconscious may be manifesting and you just don't know it. But when you empower folks to do that, it really opens up the world for people to help direct. And now they're an active member of helping you be a better version of yourself. And that's a cool place to be.
Yeah, and we're not being Pollyanna here. We're not saying to be delusional, to be in denial, to deny the exhaustion that comes with living in a society that's saturated in straight supremacy. We're not saying to give people a free pass. We're not being transactional. What we're saying here is to recognize the inherent messy nature of human relationships and the intrinsic value and dignity that's involved in transcending that and making the commitment to really get to know one another. And there's so many people who would love us given half a chance, and when we hold them hostage to jargon and purity tests, and we are inadvertently painting ourselves into a corner. We're inadvertently sub-optimizing. We're inadvertently limiting our access to love, to career advancement, whatever dimension we're using. Yes, there's going to be deal breakers. Yes, there's going to be people like you alluded to at the very beginning. There's going to be people where it's like, non-starter. There's only so far we can walk together. But by and large, I've been doing this a long time. By and large, I just feel like where we consciously make the decision and commitment to find points of connection and explore that and honor that and gently nurture those relationships, they're going to reciprocate because we have our own blind spots and our own shortcomings, and they're going to help us as well. Yeah, and it's like that rising tide that you talked about. Again, that is that bottom bar. That is how culture is built. It's not just the CEO of a company putting something on a PowerPoint. It's the daily decisions we all make at every level of an organization, how we're going to show up. Now, having said that, I'm hoping maybe you can talk about how employers who because I encounter this all the time. I work with a lot of straight bros right now. And so it's like a lot of these dudes, they just don't have a clue how to get started. So how can a quote unquote well-meaning employer or leader start to foster this culture of belonging in their workplace?
It's actually part of my keynotes and a lot of the training classes that I do. And I really break it down into three areas of focus. And think in, speak up, and act out if you're not watching the video. And it's not too hard to do. When we talk about the concept of think in, it's really understanding yourself. What unconscious biases do you have? And there's a lot of cool assessments out there, free stuff online you can do if you Google Project Implicit. It's housed by Harvard. It was a consortium of 3 researchers back in the late 90s who said, can we measure people's unconscious bias? And they're, some would argue, yeah, you can. And so whatever it is, find out your own unconscious biases, because you can't de-bias yourself, which is a real word, until you know about your own stuff. And so, that's kind of the first step for any workplace, any organization that wants to embrace creating a more inclusive, a consciously inclusive space. You got to get the individuals to do some internal focus first. So that's the think in part. Then the next one is the speak up. And speak up is really thinking about, how you're interacting with the folks around you. And it could be the language you're using. Are you using inclusive language? When someone says a disparaging comment, what do you do? There's this concept called silent collusion, where I'll tell a quick story because it's actually a real story. I was in Atlanta in a conference room with a client partner. It was the last meeting. We did this big inclusive leadership project. It's myself and Lori, one of my top doggers, and everyone's in a great mood. It's like 40 of us in the room, closing out the project. And at the top of the table, kind of at the end, was the senior executive, the executive sponsor. And they literally are the ones who signed the checks that they gave the top dog. And so they were the top dog on this little project, if you will. And we're just about to start the meeting, and you hear that senior executive, who's male, and that's important to the story, say, well, you know how all women drive. And we all just went silent. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, we all just were like, no one said anything, but we just kind of looked at the head of the table like, did I just hear that? But at that moment, since no one said anything, we were all engaging in silent collusion. We were silently agreeing or supporting that, quite frankly, stupid statement that was said. And that's another thing that I see workplaces do, or even specific leaders really don't do well, is have that confrontation. Now we're getting to that leadership courage thing we talked about a little bit ago. But it's if you want to create an inclusive workplace, you can't let those moments go by. You have to do something to make it, first of all, known that you're not on board with that kind of stuff. And second, you address that person, in this case, that senior executive, in a respectful way. And, I have this whole little strategy that I teach in my keynotes and some other things. And it's called MOPSAM. And it's kind of how do you, in that moment, not engage in silent collusion, kind of beat silent collusion. So, and it's this stupid little idea I created. If you're looking at the video, there's this dog on there, and it's a Hungarian Puli mop, which they call mop dog. And I say his name is Sam. And so if you take Sam, mop breed, and name Sam, you get Mop Sam. And it's really cheesy. But when you're in that moment and someone says, a woman drive, and you're either part of the group that's being disparaged or you're just maybe offended by it, your emotions are there. And so in that moment, sometimes it's hard to remember what to do. And that's why I created MopSam. So there's 6 things you could do. And I won't go through all 6 at this moment. Me, outpoint, say, ask, move. In the show notes, we'll put a link to a free training we created around it. But my favorite one in MopSam, there's 2. My favorite is the A. Is the ask. So you basically just ask the person what they meant by that statement. And we'll say Bob is the senior executive at the head of the table. And it might just sound like, Bob, what did you mean by that statement? Now, with a lot of these, tone, intonation, rate of speech are very important. So I could say, Bob, what did you mean by that statement? Same words. Yeah, right. Really different meaning. Bob's shields go up, gets defensive. Now we're not communicating. So this is my favorite one because it really, most of the times people are acting out of that unconscious. So that's why the think in is an important part to start. But what you're doing is you're calling someone out on that unconscious bias, in this case with the language I use, just by asking them, hey, what did you mean by that statement? I used a very similar phrase earlier when I was talking about someone who maybe has very different political views than me. That's a very interesting perspective. How did you get there? Now, if you notice in both of those, I'm very neutral. I'm not accusatory. That's an interesting perspective. How did you get there? Again, very different meaning. And so I think if we teach each other how to ask these types of questions in a neutral, honest, open tone and a respectful tone, then we'll have that dialogue. And just kind of finish this one out. The second favorite one that a lot of folks use out of the MopSam is the S, which you say a non-word that at least indicates you don't agree with what's being said. And that's actually what happened in this situation. And it's words like, whoa, what? Damn, huh? And so a gentleman who was sitting there, I was actually about to say something because that's kind of how I roll. And Lori kicks me under the table and she's like, wait. And so I'm like, okay, so I waited, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But this gentleman who was not even sitting at the table, younger in the organization, I think just got out of grad school or whatever and just joined the company, just folded his arms after Bob said, women drive, and just went, damn. And so immediately he sent the signal like, I'm not on board with what Bob just said. And then what that did is kind of let the floodgates go. And then some people did the ask, yeah, Bob, what did you mean by that? And it's such a good way. Now, the good thing is, it makes it known that I'm not there. Bad part is it doesn't address it with the person perpetrating that microaggression, which is what we call these types of things. So, and the reason why Lori kicked me and said, wait, is because the project we did was an inclusive leadership program. And it was basically like their final exam we didn't plan for to see what happened. And so, they did eventually pass, which was great. But these types of things do take practice and they do take courage. And so that's kind of where the speak up comes into play. And then act out, to kind of round this out, is really thinking about what do you do to create an inclusive space for everyone. And so this is where you collectively as a team, and a team is everybody, really start to think about who are we not including? And it could be little things like policies. Real quick story. I had a client partner. We did a project together, and then the person, the head of HR, called me and said, "Hey, Steve, I want to share something with you. Based upon the conversation and the project we did with your team, we actually changed our bereavement policy to include non-human family members." And I don't even work for that company. And I started getting a little choked up because, I mean, I probably like with you, Britt, because I mean, my canine kids are my life. I love them. They're going to be, that's where my paternal instinct gets channeled. And when I lost my canine daughter, I was broke. And to have a company say, you know what, we honor that relationship that you had, that love you felt, that if you need bereavement, good for you. We're here to support you. Go. And that's a tiny little policy change, but that sends a world of difference of inclusion to people who maybe do. And it doesn't matter if you have human kids or not. You can still have canine, feline, feathered, children. It doesn't matter. You develop that affection for them. So the act out is kind of that. What are the big and small things we can do to show that we are being an inclusive workplace? Maybe it's by the policies. Maybe it's by the artifacts. What's when you have that brochure, it says, here's our family benefits. What's that family look like? You're doing that training class and you need an image of a leader. What's that leader look like? And so it's really going beyond just the standard to think about how are we creating that inclusive workplace. So think in, speak up, and act out.
I just love that so much. What a great story. I was thinking about a couple of things during that story, one of which is the importance of nonverbal communication, which you indicated with tone of voice, but it's also, for people not watching the video, it's also physical mannerisms and body language and stuff, as we all know. And so the mode of communication is really critical, meaning if you're texting somebody, you might want to stop and take a moment and think, like, is this really the mode of communication that's going to lead to some positive outcome that's mutually beneficial, or am I just popping off? Same with social media, email, all of that kind of stuff. There's a hierarchy to the emotional intimacy that can be established at any given moment. Of course, in person is always best, and that's one of the main things when I mentor younger folks in the of any sexual orientation in the corporate space, is like, you cannot bypass relationships. You have to, business is about relationships, and you have to spend time, physical if possible, virtual if necessary, but there has to be that component so you can pick up, so you can signal those. Exactly. Steve's pointing to the relationship pillar there, and it just can't be bypassed. And then you think about the way we relate, it's through this communication piece, which is the pillar right above that. And so it's like, you
Yes,
can't
there's
bypass
a
this stuff.
method. Yeah, it's
Exactly.
funny. I often think about the very first class I took in my doctoral program. And as you said at the intro, my doctorate's in instructional technology and distance education, basically e-learning. And, prior to a pandemic, a lot of people be like, what the hell? Like, what is that? But in that very first class, my professor said, I just going to set expectations. You will never, ever replace the in-person experience. I don't care what technology's out there. You will never replace that in this case, in-person classroom experience. However, using technology and whatever tools are available, we can get as close to it as possible. And I think what's been really cool is, now I got my doctorate in this in 2005. So the technology landscape looked very different. But people are like, oh, distance learning is fairly new. No, as a kid growing up in the 70s, I remember Sally Struthers, and if you have no idea who I'm talking about, Google it, talking about your correspondence courses where you would take tests and you send them in the mail and then they come back. That's distance learning. So distance learning has been around since the 1800s. But just technology and the mode of that learning has changed and evolved. So, but that human connectedness is what has stopped us. But I think what the pandemic has shown is that you can build relationships via distance. You can do it right. Now, I get on a lot of webinars, I do a lot of podcasts, and I often tell folks, now I give them an out because I know some people have some neurodiversity and don't like the camera thing, and I respect that. So I say, if you don't have the physical bandwidth, meaning your tech maybe isn't working, and I have some of my students, especially my queer leadership programming, they're literally around the globe. So some places have better internet than others. That's fine. But if you're doing it because I just want to shop on eBay, Steve, while you're doing this class or whatever, I call people out, because if you're trying to connect with folks, I need to at least see your eyes. I want to see your gesture, even if it's just this little square box, and have that connectedness. And so I think we can all all do that, whether we're in a hybrid work environment, we're physical together, completely via distant. We can take that step to build those relationships, whatever medium and situation or context we're in. But it takes that concerted effort, Britt, just like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, coming back to choice and self-empowerment. And I guess I can hear some of my audience thinking about like to themselves, like, um, isn't this just unpaid emotional labor? Like, why is the onus on me to both experience the bigotry and to fix it? But I don't think that's what we're saying. I think what we're saying is to take charge of your life and to make choices based on, often pragmatic choices based on the moment. What does the moment require, and what does the moment ask, and what opportunities are available to you in a given moment? Some moments you're going to be tired. Some moments you're going to be less than full capacity, and you might make one choice versus another. Some moments you're going to be ready to take one for the team and be ready to dive in and help.
I talk so much about this in Pride Leadership, and you might have seen, Britt, is where, in the chapter on shaping workplace culture, many of us others are put in the situation to be the educator. It's Black History Month. Hey, Black employees, you teach us what we need to know. Like, yeah, and I give folks an out. We're recording this during LGBTQ plus History Month, in many parts of the world, and some folks are on the hook. Oh, I got to teach about trans rights. I got to tell them about Stonewall. I got to but have some grace for yourself and tap out if you need to. And that's where, if you have an employee resource group or you have other queer folks or awesome allies, take a break. Your job, because of your demographic, is not to be the educator for everyone. Now, if you choose to do so, awesome. You do it, help make the world a bit more inclusive by education, but don't feel that you have to. And I think that's the misnomer with a lot of the folks I work with, especially queer folks, is that they feel that they have to. If you have the bandwidth, fantastic. You do your gay job versus your day job, fine. But if you can't, that's okay too. Give yourself some grace, because you only have so much juice in your own battery. Find a way to maybe, the internet's amazing. I've had so many people, hit me, and even though I'm not part of the trans community, they are part of our family, and everyone knows that I'm, the gay leadership dude. So they come to me, and sometimes I say, you know what? Have you tried to Google that? Oh yeah, I guess I'm like, you Google everything else. Why would you not want to Google why pronouns are important? So, sometimes, yes, of course, sometimes we'll sit down and have the bandwidth, but sometimes I'm like, you know what? You can do the research too. Why is it important for us to celebrate, Latinx History Month too? And so I think sometimes pointing people in the right direction without going down that rabbit hole is completely okay.
Yeah, and again, I think so much of that decision making comes down to the quality of the relationship. What you're willing to invest in it and what you've experienced up to that point. Like, I was thinking of when you were telling that story, I was thinking of an HR professional that I was in relationship with through work. Notice how I constructed that sentence, orienting it around the word relationship instead of just making it a workplace transaction. And so I was invested in our mutual wellness. And this person was really proud of the corporate participation in the Pride Parade. And what I chose to expose to her is not all queer people are interested in going to a Pride Parade. Some of them think it's really fun. Some of them think it's really revolutionary. Some of them have been there, done that, and they're not perceiving it as a benefit. And my point to this story is that allyship is not a binary. It's not that you turn it on or off. There's continuing education, there's continued exposure and investment into our communities. And when you have those relationships with people, you might feel more motivated all of a sudden to invest in the relationship by educating them and see it less as a transaction.
I often say in a lot of our programs, smart allies know when to stand in front of, when to stand next to, and when to stand behind the group that they're being a good ally for.
That's really fantastic. Another thing I wanted to go back to into your story, because it just brought up so much for me, was let's put a microscope on what was happening in the moment where the person inadvertently revealed their blind spot about commenting on female drivers. We all have blind spots, especially in this day and age where a lot of our interactions are recorded for posterity. There's a pervasive feeling of fear that's just kind of like in the atmosphere right now, where a lot of like I referenced earlier, I've been working with some straight dudes lately. Like a lot of them are just so afraid of saying the wrong thing that an unintended consequence means our relationship is deprived of what it might otherwise be, the love and respect we might otherwise share if we were to summon a little bit more courage and grace to allow each other to make mistakes. Conversely, the folks in the room, let's have empathy for them as well. All of a sudden, our pulse races, our heart races. Maybe we're surprised. Maybe we don't know what to do. Maybe we start thinking about the mouths we have to feed, all of our, professional commitments. Well, how is this going to impact my career? We go through this litany of pragmatic calculations in a microsecond to figure out, what do I say? That's why I loved your framework, because it helps us practice that, almost like a reflex, a reflexive action, and it gives us a wide array of choices and allows us to let ourselves off the hook, have self empathy for ourselves in the moment, and figure out a course of action that's best for us without judgment.
And a lot of people, you're right, Britt, are really scared to be canceled. You hear like, we're cancel all the time. But I think if we're, as a workplace, going into it, say, you know what, we are human. We are basing our existence on our learned and our shared living experience. And so I may not know what our female colleagues have gone through. And so I empower them. And again, this is where, if we're doing feedback right, it works so well. Hey, call me out respectfully when I screw up, please. And I'll do the same for you. Is that okay? Yeah, that's okay. Cool. And then you move forward. So when I still do things wrong, and I live in this space. I was doing a podcast not too long ago, and the host, lovely host, a member of the trans community, and I'm going through and just talking about, oh yeah, and our trans brothers and sisters, and he said without a beat, and siblings, to cover our non-binary. And I'm like, stupid Steve, I know that. Why did I? And I'm like, hey, thank you for that. And we both moved on. And so it doesn't have to be drama when you screw up, because you're going to screw up if you are a human. But it's how we, as a workplace culture, deal with those screw ups. I might say something pretty heinous. Someone educates me on the better way to say it. Now's the opportunity. If I do it again, yeah, then I might deserve a little bit of hey, Steve, we told you. But if I learn from that mistake, fan flippantastic, you're done. And I think that's the attitude we need to foster a bit more, is that respectful feedback, but also that grace when someone does mess up, to educate them and then just kind of move forward.
Right, right. And again, with relationships, if we're in relationship with them, I think that grace happens more naturally, where it's like, hey, we in this community can't even agree on the terminology. How are you as a straight person going to keep it all together when you don't even have the lived experience? So let me just honor the fact that, like, you're trying and you said a word, cut yourself some slack. And then that just cuts through. It's like the bubble bursts, and all of a sudden you can relate to each other as messy, flawed individuals, which is what we all really are.
And if you're building trust, which is literally the secret to good leadership, you're building trust. And if I think about the 6 competencies, when you do these 6, that's the outcome. You're building trust with those around you. And if I have trust, then people are okay to make mistakes, because they know where you're coming from. Now, if, for example, someone corrects you on the pronouns and you still mispronoun them after like 12 interactions, yeah, then that's something a little bit different. And you have the right to call that person out again. And there's something deeper happening. But if, I just talked to a parent, oh my gosh, it was last week at a conference. I did a keynote and I had a booth, and this wonderful woman came up and she's like, oh, I still love the work you're doing, gay leadership dude. I have a gay daughter and a trans child, and they're lovely. But it took me 7 months to get their name correct on my trans child. I said, so how did you do that? Oh no, it wasn't name. It was the pronoun. She's like, I still keep screwing up the pronouns. I said, well, how are you addressing that? She's like, I just call them by their name. No pun intended for the movie. But it's like, she's like, until I get back into that sync. And I said, and what did your child think of that? They're fine with it. And I thought, like, good solution. You do you. They worked it out and figured it out. And that's kind of at the end of the day, we're all humans and we're all interacting with each other. And so whatever works to make that occur in a respectful way, awesome. But if you're doing it as a leader in, you're just digging your heels in and not embracing, then there's an opportunity to have a conversation with yourself.
Right. And then on the flip side, if we are anointing ourselves as hall monitors, that is also unpaid labor to be the judge and the jury of the purity of the people that that we're encountering. And so again, it's exhausting. You're already exhausted just from living in the society. Cut yourself a break and let's relate to each other as individuals.
That's why I love the Mopsam A.
Exactly.
If you have the bandwidth.
Exactly.
What did you mean by that statement, Bob?
Exactly. And there's like you said, your framework gives us a variety of approaches. And as you said, if it's a pattern of behavior, that's reflective of a pattern of choices. It's one thing to have a slip of the tongue. The second time, the third time, whoa. And then now you have, hopefully your workplace has some HR policies that you can lean into. You have relationships with the HR team or whomever that you can go to for counsel and advice.
And as a word of action, if you are encountering these types of things repeatedly, one of the best things to leverage in your favor is the workplace values and the workplace mission and vision. Because I guarantee, as I said at the beginning, I've yet to encounter a client partner who doesn't have in their values somewhere about embracing differences. It might be phrased different ways. So when someone's really othering you or disenfranchising you or anyone else, have the conversation through the workplace values, because that's the shared expectation you have. It doesn't have to be your personal values, even though they may align, but use those values like a sword and a shield in those conversations. And I do, even with clients. And I make sure to really understand what their values are. Case in point, if you follow me on LinkedIn, which I encourage anyone listening to do, when a lot of these companies have been pulling back on their embracing of diversity, equity, inclusion, especially as it relates to queer folks in the HRC index, corporate quality index, my first thing I do for Ford, and I'm going to call names out because they own it, Ford, Lowe's, Tractor Supply, insert all these not cool folks here. I go to their website, I screenshot their corporate values, and then I take a red line, a red marker, at least a digital marker, and I start correcting their values, because what they're showing me is not the values that they state. So they're really being performative. They're not being true to their corporate values. And I think that's the opportunity we all have to call folks out on it. Yes, they're being jerks against us, but you say you do business this way, yet you just made these statements and are doing these actions that go completely against your own values. Pick a lane, buddy. Figure it out, because until they do, we can absolutely call them out on it, especially when they're disenfranchising us or members of the queer community or any of us others who are out there.
Yeah, a couple things. Steve is fantastic on LinkedIn. We're going to load up the show notes with all sorts of goodies where you can start to engage with his content. He does a lot of free content as service work. It's absolutely inspirational and beautiful. I highly encourage you to check it out. And I think also what you just described is the power of being publicly queer. Whatever label feels like home to you, the emphasis on the word publicly, not on coming out, which is almost can be, we as queer people can make that about our families and kind of narrowcast what that term means. What I've started to phrase it as is publicly queer, meaning I'm standing up and risking all sorts of financial gain, backlash, whatever, to be a beacon of hope for other queer people around the world who aren't in as fortunate a position. And if you are willing to be publicly queer in your company, then you're going to have mentees seek you out in those moments. They might even trust you more than HR, more than other. They might start with you, depending on the nature of your relationship, depending on the nature of the corporation. And is that not what being a leader is all about?
Being at that authentic self, 100%. Yep. And I actually talked about that in Pride Leadership. Matter of fact, I got some really great advice from my editor as well as my publisher when Pride Leadership, the first book, came out. And she, I had in the chapter on authenticity in Pride Leadership something to the effect of, if you are not out at work, stop reading this book. And they really pushed back on me, and they were smart to do that because they were right. Because the comment that Jen, my awesome lesbian publisher, said, she's like, someone reading this book who isn't out is probably the one who really needs to read this book the most. And I'm like, Jen, you're 100% right. Thank you. But it's true. I mean, still, if you look at the data, and we can research it, from when Pride Leadership was written, 2018, to when Your Queer Career, which is my latest book that came out in March of this year, both books cite how many queer people in the US are actually out at work. It's still about the same, 50%. And so, you know what? But and I say this as someone of privilege who is out, who's a white cisgendered gay dude of a certain age. Um, Someone might not feel comfortable with that, and that's okay. So, you can still be a quote unquote ally, or be perceived as an ally, or still support the community, even if you're secretly a part of it. And that's why a lot of big companies don't really ask sexual orientation for people who join the LGBT employee resource group, because they're like, you know what, if you're here, you're I'll just say, queer embracing, whatever that means, and that's okay. And so you do you, boo. But you do what's comfortable for you based upon your level of physical safety, mental safety, financial safety. But yes, it takes all of us being out there. And the more of us who are shouting from the rooftops, these things you're doing, Tractor Supply and Lowe's, are not cool, the more that we can facilitate change.
Steve, what are some ways people can engage with your work? Like, we're going to load up the show notes, we're going to give them links, but just by and large, like, how can they start to wade into your message, learn more about you?
Probably the easiest thing is to go to our main website, topdoglearning.biz. There you'll find the different courses we have, the books. You can meet my team, or follow me on LinkedIn. That's the main channel I do, and Instagram too. They kind of do both of them. But LinkedIn, we have our weekly newsletter called Your Queer Career, based on my latest book. You can see when we're going to do free stuff. We also do have a free LGBTQ and ally monthly leadership networking event called Pride Leadership, the Leader Circle. It's open to anybody. Come on in. I'll throw like a 10-minute, here's the topic of the month. A lot of the little slides, if you're watching, are from those talks. And then there's a lot of breakouts for people to mix and mingle and just be able to network and support and share their perspective, just to build more of a leadership community, both for LGBTQ folks, as well as those awesome allies that are out there. But topdoglearning.biz is probably the main stop.
That's awesome. That's really great. And in fact, for those of you watching the video, I'm holding up one of his books because I'm a big fan, not just hosting him here. So, I've just learned so much from you, Steve, from your books, from your writing, from LinkedIn, from today. I cannot thank you enough from the bottom of my heart. You're just changing the world and helping so many people in our community. And I just think that's awesome.
Thank you. It's truly a pleasure to be here.
Oh, wonderful. Well, dear listeners, you have done it. You have made it through another episode of Not Going Quietly. We could not do this without you. And thank you so much for your support. You are the heart of this program, the soul of this program. And that's why we keep coming back. So thanks again. Thanks to our featured guest, Dr. Steve Yacovelli. Please check him out. I'm going to load up the show notes. We gave you lots of great links today. He does brilliant work on his website, on LinkedIn, among other social channels. Until next time, everybody, my name is Britt East, host of Not Going Quietly. Bye-bye. You've been listening to Not Going Quietly with your host, Britt East. Thanks so much for joining us on this wild ride as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy. Check out our show notes for links, additional information, and episodes located on your favorite podcast platform.